me welcome Jason to the Bloch.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited to share what I've been able to learn from a lot of great minds, what I've been able to apply in the world with a lot of great businesses over the past 20 years. Design thinking or human-centered design or design, and those labels get used by practitioners somewhat interchangeably. I would argue is perhaps the most important topic for education and business. If it's not the most important topic, it's certainly one of the most important topics in my point of view, and I'm happy to share a perspective on it that I hope will advance your understanding of this topic and candidly give you at least one thing that you can start doing differently in your education and your work starting tomorrow. Just to kind of help me calibrate a little bit, if you guys would be so brave and so courageous in front of your peers to help me out a little bit. For any of you in the room, I'm just trying to understand who among you, by show of hands, are steeped in this work. You are practicing designers. This is how you work. This is second nature to you already. All right, so we've got some people that are pretty good at this stuff. And how many of you would say that you're aware of it, you know some things about it, you've had some familiarity, maybe you've gone to a class, maybe you've done a crash course, but you've got some knowledge, right, by show of hands? All right, cool. Who's brand new? Like, you've heard the words, you're not quite sure. All right, awesome. We got a good mix. I think we'll be able to share some material with you that is hopefully going to unlock something new for everybody here. My name's Jason. I'm with VMLY&R. Just a quick bit of details on my background. I came up in the education system studying poetry. Milton's Paradise Lost and Virgil's Aeneid in Latin specifically. I studied those two poems side by side for 4 years. And, of course, like anyone would do with their bouncing baby education, I immediately became an apprentice and went straight into product design in the bicycle industry. And I designed and fabricated world-class racing bicycles for most of my 20s. By a complete and utter accident of fate, I was befriended by a 3-year-old child at a local coffee shop that led me to meet a guy named Scott McCormick, the M in VML. And this was in 1999. He said, there's something interesting about the way you think, and I would love it if you would come and join what to me seemed like an enormous company of 175 people. Gigantic, enormous company. And straight away we began doing work that we would now call digital transformation. I had no idea what I was doing. I was inventing it as we went. Later I had an opportunity to go and study brand building, consumer behavior, economics, and how brands and human psychology contribute to how businesses grow. Later, I got invited to go back to the bicycle industry and build innovation capabilities, brand building capabilities, and marketing capabilities on top of an established distribution firm. I've had a winding and unusual path, and I can share with you that the foundation of all of those things is design thinking. Right? It is what has allowed me to successfully move across all of those kinds of sectors. I've been back at VMLY&R now for about 5 years, really championing the cause of design thinking in our business and in business at large. Right? I'm going to assume that if you live in Kansas City, you have at least passing familiarity with a little company called VML, now called VMLY&R. Right? We're a pretty significant force of creative thinking and critical thinking in town. We're pretty proud of the work that we've been able to do, and especially proud of being able to do that work here in Kansas City. And that's why, while I give many of these talks, this is maybe the one that I'm really most grateful to be able to share with you guys today. When I say that design is important in the world and important for business, it's because of a specific problem that I can observe. Right? 89% of companies will tell you that they compete on the basis of giving customers a good experience. Right? 89% are like, we're in the customer experience business. 8% of people will tell you that they get a good experience with companies. Right? And I think that's an enormous challenge. I think that's an enormous opportunity. If you follow the Freakonomics podcast, there are interesting gaps in how we educate children in math and the practical application of data fluency and data skills in the market, right? So there's practical applications of addressing these kinds of gaps all over our economy and all over all of our businesses. And I think that design and design thinking is what's going to help us close those gaps, right? So we're going to get really practical now, right? What do we do about design? What do we do about design thinking, right? I will say that there's a first thing that we have to do, which is to learn some process. And I say some process quite deliberately. Learn a process, follow the steps with discipline, right? The IDEO model that emerged in conjunction with the Stanford D School, it's probably the most famous, right? And they would say that the steps of design thinking are to empathize, right? And empathy is this really, really interesting quality. Empathy expresses itself in a couple of different ways, right? Empathy is about understanding the needs, the goals, the problems, the desires of an other person, right? And it's important to be able to understand. Companies have gotten pretty good at that. They do research into understanding the consumer, right? But it's quite another thing. A second form of empathy is about being able to relate to the needs, the desires, the problems, and the motivations of an other person, right? Cognitive empathy is to understand. Effective empathy is to be able to relate, right? When we do design and we do design well, it is critically essential not only to understand, but to relate personally to the needs, the skills, the needs, the motivations, and the problems that people have in the world, right? Like both are necessary, right? So this idea of empathy is endemic to all practice of design, right? The Stanford and IDEO model calls it out as a step. They will tell you empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and it's a good process. It works really, really well. It's done a lot of good things in the world, right? IDEO has a different way of articulating the same process, right? They talk about 3 phases of inspiration, ideation, and implementation. Also, very, very useful way of thinking about it, right? And they layer in the notion of divergence, right, which is broad, boundless, exploratory thinking, right? Often into the realm of the silly and the unimaginable, right? The impossible, the implausible, the inconceivable, the impractical, where all the magic and creativity and innovation actually lies, followed by convergence, right, which is the deliberate bringing together of ideas to form something that you can actually execute, right? Divergence and convergence is another quality of design that is universal across all models, right? So when IDEO talks about this, they go from inspiration, ideation, implementation, and they cycle between divergence and convergence, and that relationship of cycling between the two becomes critically important, right? Explore a broad number of ideas, figure out which of them are any good, right? And I can tell you that work that has come out of MIT demonstrates that the surest path to a great idea is mostly a function of how many ideas you generate on the outset, right? That they took a group of improv performers and they put them head to head with some of the best innovators at some of the most innovative companies across the world. And it turns out that the improv artists generated more innovative ideas and more commercially viable ideas than the innovation experts. And the explanation was purely a function of how many ideas the improv artists generated, right? So this notion of divergence and exploration and being free from boundaries is critically important, right? The British Design Council has a model. It's also a good model, right? We define the problem, we get to insights and hypotheses, we ultimately move to concepts and prototypes, and eventually we get to solutions, and again we see this pattern of divergence and convergence, right? I think one of the things that they add that's nice, which is your first idea is about what's the right thing to design, and then later how do you design that thing the right way, right? It's another layer, I think, that becomes really, really important to this work that we call design thinking, this work that we call design. Right? Many companies, including a client of ours, Ford Motor Company, they ultimately design a process specific to their organization, right? And it's perfectly okay to do that. In fact, it can be really, really effective to do that, right? Intuit has a pretty simple and elegant model, which is at the center of it, they want to get to delight for people, right? isn't that really interesting? Intuit is in the delight business, right? Fascinating. TurboTax is in the delight business, right? But you'll see that they talk about deep customer empathy, right? Not just empathy, not just understanding, not just insight, deep customer empathy, which I think is really interesting. Go broad to grow narrow. You should be able to see divergence and convergence in there. Rapid experiments with customers, right? This notion of experimentation is really, really important, right? In design, we know that the future is notoriously hard to predict. It's very, very stubborn in unfolding its secrets to us, right? And so the best way to get to the future is to stop trying to predict it and to just start trying to invent it. And the way we invent it is by running as many experiments as fast as we possibly can, right? So as you start thinking across all of these models, the foundation is empathy, right? The pattern is divergence and convergence. What are you trying to do? You're trying to figure out what's the right thing to design, and then later figure out how to design the right thing, right? And you do that by running as many experiments as you can as quickly as possible, right? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't suggest that we have our own model, and I was sharing this morning that ours infuses some learnings from the world of behavioral economics and behavioral science, right? So we talk about the importance of a reframe followed by investigation, synthesizing, exploration, and delivery, right? Reframing we find to be a critical first step. Reframing is figuring out how you view, how you conceptualize, how you understand, and how you frame a problem. Maybe even figuring out what are your beliefs that might limit your view of the problem, and then intentionally moving to a different, often wildly different perspective and reimagining what the notion or what the nature of the problem is from that different place. And maybe doing it a third time, and maybe doing it the fourth time, and maybe doing it the fifth time until you discover a way of framing the problem that is uniquely powerful, right? There's something really, really important to this notion of reframing, right? We're gonna start speeding up a little bit now, right? I wanna get under the hood, right? So step one, find a process. Step two, practice the process. There's a lot of good processes, a lot of great work has been done by bright minds over the past 20 years, right? You almost cannot find a bad process, but how you practice the process matters, right? So if I get under the hood a little bit and talk about this way of working a slightly different way, here is a really, really simplified version of how most companies and how most people solve problems most of the time, right? We're gonna figure out our objective. Of course, we want our objective to be SMART, specific, measurable, actionable, right? Right? We want to be smart. I need a measurable objective, and then I'm going to go out into the world, I'm going to do some research, I'm going to develop some concrete facts upon which to make some decisions, and I want to get to a solution, ideally a proven solution, right? Funny thing about this world, everyone wants to be a leader, no one wants to go first. Isn't that interesting, right? These kind of behavioral patterns are important, right? So here's how businesses have solved problems really, really well. Right? A lot of value has been created by using this kind of a problem-solving approach. That's not what we're going to do at all, right? In fact, we're going to fight this instinct, right? We're either going to fight this instinct or we're going to exhaust this instinct, right? I kind of don't care which approach you choose. Like if your organization is itchy to be quick to solution, like exhaust that, get that energy out, and then start anew with the hard work of working in a design-driven way. Right? So now let's talk about a design-driven way of thinking about how we apply our process. We're going to figure out what's our objective, right? That's cool. We should have a goal, right? In design, we often call this an aspiration or an intention, right? In our practice, it leads to a central question, right? Then you're going to resist this instinct to be quick to solution, or you're going to exhaust the instinct to be quick to solution. Doesn't matter, right? Whatever works best for your organization. Then we're going to reframe that objective as some worthy or worthwhile human question, right? So it's not sell more cars. It's how might we help people move through this world more effectively and more affordably, right? It's not sell more cars. It's how might we remake the energy system of this world right? Which is what Tesla has done. They've literally forced the world to begin to rebuild its energy system because the objective wasn't sell more cars. The question was, how can I do something more worthwhile, right? This is why I think this notion of reframe is incredibly, incredibly important, right? We work with an organization called Sherwin-Williams, right? The objective could be sell more paint, or it could be help painting professionals be better at their craft, right? They're very, very different, right? Once you've reframed this objective, we go out and investigate what we know, right? Some people will say, all insight starts with data, and I'm like, huh, well, that's interesting. All human progress suggests otherwise. Actually, what we wonder is incredibly useful in terms of how we get to insights. We use the word investigate, right? Because research often means read things that other people have figured out on our behalf, right? An investigation is go out into the world and look for interesting clues. I've taken an automotive executive and asked them to go get their vehicles serviced. They've been working on the service experience for years, and they know all the pain points from all the research, and they know it very, very well. Thank you very much. And when I ask them to go and get their vehicles serviced, and they patiently explain to me that that's not how things work, and then I patiently explain to them that that's what is required, right? They come back, and what they understand about the opportunity is remarkably and profoundly changed, right? There's something about real-world knowing and real-world wondering, right? From them, we synthesize a perspective, right? And oftentimes, it's synthesizing a perspective based on similar questions that might exist in the world or might ever have existed in the world, right? There's something called eras analysis, right? So you think beyond your category. You think beyond your context to find additional perspectives on how these kinds of questions have emerged and perhaps even been answered throughout history or throughout the world. And then, and here's where it gets really, really fun. Here's where teams are just like, we love this. Explore a vast range of potential solutions, right? And the key emphasis is vast. The quality of the ideas you get to is mostly a function of how many you generate at the front end, right? And then, and only then, you choose and deliver a solution that best fits the question, right? And if you follow this kind of process, you will find that the destination that you arrive at is far more imaginative, far more innovative, and far more commercially valuable than what you would have developed on the outset, being quick to solution based on the facts that are very concrete and an objective that your organization already knows how to measure, right? This is how this kind of works under the hood, right? Now, our model looks a little bit like this. I do want to share something that is, again, inherent in the field of design, I would argue under-discussed, right? Which is when we look at this kind of a model, reframe, investigate, synthesize, explore, and deliver, what sits underneath that is an elemental relationship between what is concrete and real and what is abstract and possible. And those two things are wildly related. They are not different things. They are two ends of a critically important spectrum, right? There's another dimension here that's really, really important, right? The connection between thinking and making. Somewhere along the way, we got the wrong idea into our heads that the human mind is somehow separate and different than the human body. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but it turns out that making and thinking are critically related. And one of the things that becomes important is recognizing that making is a form of thinking, right? So when we talk about prototyping, oftentimes it's like, don't just think there, make something, right? The act of making is critical to learning more about what it is that you might want to make, right? So sometimes like we don't have to worry so much about like deep analysis. We can just go find some cheap materials and start whacking away to create an early, ugly, cheap version of a thing to generate the learning that we need to then make the thing better, right? There is this relationship there. When we flex between those two cycles and we do it on purpose, that's how we start unlocking real learning. That's how we start inventing the future, right? Like the relationship here is if you layer on sort of zones of activity when you're cycling between reframing, investigating, synthesizing, and exploring, that's where you're generating all of your experimentation. That's where you're generating all of your learning, right? At the Institute of Design, they call that the mode of discovery, right? Then after you've kind of figured out a lot of your learning, that's the point where you start to move to execute. And then once you've executed, you begin to enhance, right? Because we're always iterating, we're always moving forward. Now, I will share with you that when you begin doing this kind of work, this is some of my favorite parts, right? Some more practical realities of what we have to accept and what we have to embrace to become designers is the notion of get comfort with discomfort. Get really comfortable with discomfort. Discomfort is part of how you know you're doing it right, right? Like if you think about the last time you did something for the first time, especially something that you weren't very good at, you remember how that felt? That's how this work feels all the time if you're doing it well and you're doing it right. Now, let's talk for a moment why that is, right? You've got this notion of a model, and because it's a model, it's got some structure to it, and man, do human beings like structure. We love structure, holy cow. The sweet, sweet, comfortable embrace of structure and predictability in an unpredictable world. We love it. And because it has structure, we think it works like this. We want it to work like this. We've been trained in education, we've been trained in business to think that processes are about steps, and that steps are sequential, and that step A leads to step B, and step B leads to step C, and I hit my milestone and I get my deliverables, and that is called progress. And so it looks like this, but it works like that. And when it works like that, that's how you know you might be doing it right, right? Too often in business, we think we have the question figured out and then we move forward, but we never give ourselves the ability to go back based on having learned something new, right? We get stuck. We get overly attached to something that happened previously, and so we keep kind of marching ahead without recognizing that the best path forward is to allow ourselves to perform the steps in any order, right? So I can start with something that's already in market and start running experiments to improve it that lead me to learnings that lets me fundamentally reframe it, that gives me a whole different trajectory of investigation that leads me to synthesize wholly different kinds of insights that then allow me to brainstorm and explore wildly different kind of possibilities, right? If you live in this part of the country, which I think you do, you may have heard of a race in Emporia, Kansas called Dirty Kansas, right? People ride bikes on gravel. I can tell you that 8 years ago, a gravel bike did not exist in the world. It was not a thing. I only know that because I was part of the team that created that category, right? We didn't create it from nothing, right? We looked at what was going on in road bikes, cyclocross bikes, and mountain bikes, and how people were using hacks and workarounds to explore this new territory called gravel. And we investigated it deeply, and we participated in it fully, and that's what unlocked the insights that allowed us to create an entirely new cycling platform and an entirely new category that 10 years from now is likely to eclipse both road and mountain, right? You can start at any point in the process. This idea of discomfort is really, really important, right? Because it looks like this and works like this, it feels like this. And that's part of how you know you're doing it right, right? Last few things. I want to give you some practical knowledge, things that I see in every organization I have the privilege to work with. If you want to get going with design thinking, if you want to get going with human-centered design in your organization, and I hope that you do, you are absolutely positively going to have to think about implementing design as its own kind of design thinking challenge. And that means that you're going to have to hack the system that you already operate in, right? And what do I mean when I say hack the system? Well, we go into organizations and we commandeer physical space that is overlooked and underused. We often steal furniture throughout different parts of the organization in order to build suitable design spaces. We often put up pirate flags in order to signal to the teams that are entering into that environment that there is something different going on here, right? We're not going through official channels and requisitioning permission. We just go find space that no one else wants and furniture that no one else wants, and we take it and we remake it, and we just run the experiment, right? And in our culture, there's something about the pirate flag that's really, really important, right? To giving people a clear signal that in this space, we work differently, right? It's a different set of rules that apply, right? That hacking approach is really, really important. Oftentimes, resources are the enemy of resourcefulness, right? So rather than seeking permission and budget, go find the stuff that other people don't want and start hacking it together and building a space for yourself where you can run these experiments and begin to deliver results. I will also tell you, holy cow, you have no idea how bad companies are at buying basic supplies. I have had to come up with the most interesting pirate-like ways to get sticky notes and Sharpies and markers and boards, right? This is, at a big corporation, provisioning supplies is an enormous hurdle, right? You're gonna have to find ways to hack the system to get the basic materials that you need, right? We do it all the time. It's amazing when a lunch order shows up with a bunch of materials, right? It's absolutely fantastic the way that works sometimes, right? When you start to do it well, and here's another space that you commandeered, all of a sudden the way people work together looks really messy and analog, right? Hacking the system. It turns out that most companies lock their precious thinking up in PowerPoints that sit on computers that no one else sees, right? Hack the system, break the rules, make the thinking visual, get it up, get it out, and get it in a space that people can collaborate in, right? This notion of hacking the system is really, really important. You know when you have a space that looks like this, like you're getting somewhere, right? When thinking is visual, thinking is out, thinking is up on boards where all can see, all can contribute, right? You're starting to create a center and an energy of collaboration, right? You will have to hack the organizations in which you work. And finally, I would suggest that it becomes important as designers that we model a certain kind of behavior that is endemic to design, is confusing to business people, but refreshing and invigorating to them once they begin to do it, right? These are some of my most valuable visual artifacts, and they happened by accident. I was running an experiment. So when I start working with teams, especially executive teams, especially very serious, very responsible executive teams, right? We bring them into design sessions and I'm like, all right, we've got some specific behaviors that we are all of us going to embrace during our time together. And one of those is that we are going to be here now. And that means that your precious electronics go away. You don't even get to have them on the table. You have to turn your phones off. And I have a little basket I call the basket of brilliance, and that's where you have to keep it. You are going to be here now. The highest level of human performance is when we experience a state called flow. Flow is the result of focus, deep focus. If you want to be focused, you have to be undistracted. If you want to be undistracted, you have to throw off the shackles of our Silicon Valley overlords and put your phones away into the basket of brilliance. Right? It's not the bucket of shame, it's the basket of brilliance, right? Be here now. If I can get executives focused and in a room collaborating together for a week, we accomplish in days what would otherwise take them months. Happens every single time, right? Utterly foreign behavior, but it's behavior that we very deliberately model, right? Bravery. I ask people to do wacky things that they have never done before, certainly not in front of their peers, right? Like, innovation is an act of courage. Exploring wild ideas is an act of courage, right? When I ask people to write their name upside down and backwards with their wrong hand, and I do, right? I am asking them to show me some bravery, right? I ask people to be uncertain. It turns out that certainty is the enemy of innovation because of a little quirk in the human brain called confirmation bias. The more certain you are of something, the more closed you are to alternative possibilities, right? And so we ask people to practice the behavior called uncertainty, right? I ask people to be wrong, lots. Holy cow, I spend hours where I put people in situations where it is impossible for them to be right, to get them good at wrong practice, right? Because they have decades of professional achievement based on being right and having the answer. And it's always the safest answer and the most boring answer that they're right about. They champion safe, boring answers constantly and all the time. And so we have to model this behavior called being wrong constantly and all the time and being comfortable with it, right? And going hand in hand with being wrong a lot is being not so gosh darn self-serious, right? I take executives and I ask them to be silly, right, in front of their peers, right? It's amazing what we begin to unlock when we drop the unnecessary veil of self-seriousness, right? I ask people to be vulnerable, right? And we model that behavior as well. I ask people to be kind, right? And we model that behavior as well, right? And fundamentally, I ask people to be helpful, right? And that is behavior that we model not only in the work that we do in specific design sessions, that is behavior that we model as designers constantly and all the time, right? Last thing, and we're near the end, right? So Design Thinking 101, I would suggest, and our experience demonstrates that the process, having a process, learning the process, those steps are simply a beginning. They're an amazing beginning, an important foundation, right? But design thinking is simply another way to define and solve problems. Roger Martin talks about it as the intersection between critical thinking and creative problem solving. I would suggest that design thinking is not different work, that creatives do not have a monopoly on creativity, the strategists do not have a monopoly on smart thinking, right? Design thinking is not different work, it is a different way of working, right? And Roger Martin 20 years ago said, it's not enough for business people to understand design. We all must become designers. That's where the future lies, right? We do this by embracing uncertainty and learning, right? Very critically embracing uncertainty and learning as a core operating principles of our work, right? We run experiments like crazy that helps our organizations evolve and our people evolve. I can tell you that this way of working not only produces better work, it produces better people, right? I cannot tell you how many people have described themselves as changed for the better as the result of adopting this way of working, right? We help our organizations evolve. And ultimately, right, the result of all of this is that we provide a more human and we provide a more humane way of working together. If you look out at the world at the companies that provide the best customer experiences in the world, right? 89% of companies say they compete on the basis of customer experience. 8% of customers say they have a great experience. If you look at the companies that are winning on providing great experiences to customers, they are the most collaborative, and they have design as the heart of their business operating system. And that is all that I have, with one final thought, right? If you can define the problem differently than everyone else, then you have a shot at generating alternatives that other people aren't thinking about. So that's what I have for the scripted talk, and I only went 7 minutes over, so I feel good about that.
Great.
And I think we have time for Q&A.
Thank you. That was phenomenal, Jason. So this was new for me, right? I mean, I'd heard the terms design thinking, but never really had any sort of understanding at all. So thank you for being super prepared and delivering thoughtful remarks. So I was uncomfortable with the whole, we think this way, but it's actually this way. Just the drawing made me uncomfortable, which tells you probably a lot about me. But
about people at large.
Okay.
You're not alone. You're in the majority.
But one question I have, so I serve on the Kansas City Public School Board, and I immediately started thinking about, we need to rethink how we educate our kids.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so I wonder, do you guys do work in that space, and how can we sort of infuse some of this way of thinking early on in a kid's life so that they become problem solvers or designers for life?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a wonderful question. It's a topic that, I mean, as a father and as a designer, I'm really, really curious about and interested in. One of our clients is NWEA, and we are working with them right now to kind of redesign how student progress is envisioned and measured, right? So that it's like less of a quarterly based on standardized, externally defined metrics, and it's more real-time feedback, helping kids understand their own design and learning styles, right? And there's significant investment being made underway there. I think you're absolutely right, and I know that there's a number of experiments being run throughout parts of the country looking at specific specific topics of how do we begin to redesign how education works. So I think it's a great question.
I don't have, I just wanted to make a comment. Your first slide was about the D-school process.
Yeah.
And they have a portion, if you go to their website, they have a portion where they've actually tried to develop a curriculum with exercises for teaching design thinking to grade school children. So that could be something you could look at.
We'll work it around.
Well, actually, I'll ask a quick question.
As
So
long as you
you-
have the block.
And I've got, because I
As
have
long
the
as you have
block.
the block.
I have the block. So you mentioned building on this education theme.
Yeah.
What do colleges get it? Where do colleges get it wrong?
Oh my God, that's a
It's not for you to answer.
holy cow. Where do colleges get it wrong? So look, I'm a liberal arts guy, right? And I think that a lot of the decisions that got made over the past 50 years, right, beginning to de-emphasize sort of liberal arts foundational level education, I think that's been a wrong decision, and I think that decision is going to exert itself more urgently over time. I think that, part of what our education system has done a good job is producing people who have technical skills to do repeatable technical jobs, right? And I think some of the downfall in that is I don't know that we've done a good job of teaching people to be flexible and adaptive thinkers. I know when I speak to many of my engineer friends, early in their education, they are allowed to believe that engineering is a creative discipline. By the time they finish their academic careers, they realize that engineering is about reinforcing precedents, right? That it's an anti-creative discipline in practice and in the labor market. I think that there's going to be a significant remaking of the education system at some point. I think the fundamental economics of education are unsustainable. I think there's a big reckoning there. I think that as more and more of the economy is robotized, the need for flexible, adaptive thinking grows critically important. I think we underinvest in data fluency. I think we overinvest in sort of computational type work. I think we're still teaching things that are already being offloaded to computers and not preparing students for the next wave of the economy, in my opinion.
Over here, Jason.
Thanks for sharing your insights. Do you have a sense of how organizations should look at talent acquisition and talent development in terms of people who are willing to, have the capability to, or inclined to behave and think in this way? Or is this just something that you think is teachable only through the experience of doing it? How would you look at talent acquisition in this realm of design thinking?
That's a wonderful question. In 3 parts. There's a 95% chance that each and every one of you were born a creative genius, right? And there's some really great research around people as creative animals, right? What I have seen consistently is that telling people about design thinking gives you something, right? Showing people design thinking gives them something. But until people literally start practicing it for themselves, there's something in the brain that doesn't unlock, right? So in design thinking, we often talk about tool sets and skill sets and mindsets, right? As companies, we're very good at investing in tools. We're moderately bad at investing in skills, and we're utterly bad at investing in mindsets, right? Now, one example of this is the percentage of technology investments that companies make that go unutilized or underutilized is more than 50% and often reaches 75%. Companies are very good at buying technology. It's concrete, right? This is really, really weird. If your goal is an amazing meal, for anybody that doesn't work at VMLY&R, anybody that wants to throw out an answer to this, if your goal is an amazing meal and you have a choice, an amazing chef with so-so ingredients and a terrible kitchen, or an amazing kitchen with really good ingredients and a terrible cook, which scenario would you choose? Right, right? We will choose the chef. We know that. What do companies invest in? Right, the exact opposite. Companies like to make investments in things that are concrete and predictable. Companies dislike making investments in things that are abstract and unprovable, right? So as I think about bringing this into business, step one, I think it's important that it becomes part of the business operating system. I believe that design thinking will rise alongside all traditional management disciplines, which are mostly scientific management. I believe that design will permeate and should permeate all parts of the business, including operations, including finance, because I think that comfort with ambiguity and lateral thinking becomes more and more important over time. I think we have to do a much better job of hiring deliberately and internally valuing diversity of perspective. And then I think that we have to create a culture in which not being right all the time is not only okay, it's valued. Right? It's a wonderful question and one I'd love to discuss it at length, but I want to give as much license to questions as we can. The block.
I'm envious that you got to spend 4 years focusing on just the Virgil and Dante and doing that side by side. So that liberal arts piece, and you mentioned it, what is it about that effort that you made as a young person to do that and studying those side by sides that unlocked that ability to go ahead and have something that very early on somebody identified as, I need you working with me?
Yeah, so I actually think it's 3 pieces, right? So I had a wonderful professor that I ran across early in my college days. His name was Tom Clayton at the University of Minnesota, taught in the classics department, and I will tell you, and Tom would tell you, that he hated undergrads. Hated them, right? And I mean, I was fortunate enough to be born with the kind of mind that made learning both easy and enjoyable. And I was a kid who was a terrible athlete with a big competitive streak. And so like the second I heard that there was a professor that hated undergrads, like I went running at that so hard, because I'm like, let's see what happens. This is going to be fun. I think there's something about learning Latin and the classics, like studying a language that does not exist, that exercises a critical thinking part of the brain in a really interesting way. I think that when you then apply that to both Milton and Virgil's Aeneid side by side, like there is a level and a layer of critical thinking that gets exercised in the brain, but it's also super creative because you're having to discover parallels between the 2 poets, one of whom influenced the other. You're critically evaluating creative material, right? And so like critical thinking brain and creativity brain got like deeply exercised for a lot of years. And then I flipped out of that and got to do critical thinking and creative problem solving in a physical form called a bicycle, right? And machine body interface around cycling and how do you get like incremental power out of a human body using the design of a physical machine. So for me, I think that combination of things gave me a really wonderful foundation.
Right over here.
Block.
Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm curious, what do you see as the major obstacles for most firms to be able to adopt this style of thinking?
Companies hate uncertainty. They hate it. Companies love predictability. They love reliability. In design, we sometimes talk about this tug of war between reliability and viability, right? And what has been valued and what has been valuable over the past 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years of business, right, is to take an operating model and make it a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better, right? If I think about manufacturing in particular, manufacturing looks at variability as a defect, right? And so the behavior and the value system and the culture of a manufacturing environment, of an engineering environment, of most business operating systems, they see variability and their only goal is to minimize and eliminate that variability, right? From a manufacturing perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and certainly from a financial perspective. In design, we actually see that variability may be opportunity, right? Variability may be a good thing, right? And like what we know from nature is that variability is the engine that drives evolution, right? And we know that that is true in nature. We also know that that's true in business.
So how do you balance those needs for variability as well as stability?
Yeah, so the guidance that I give a lot of people is if what you're doing is working wonderfully well, right? If what works for you is to get more of what you already have, design may not be for you, right? Broadly, what we see is, like, if I just use the 4 Ps as a shortcut way to sort of think about a business, and you think about divergence and convergence, most products in most categories are so highly converged and so roughly substitutable, right? The competitive advantage on a product basis is really, really hard. Very, very short-lived and wildly expensive, right? Product parity is the rule, not the exception. If I go to pricing as a way to compete and win in business, pricing is so converged in category and it's so wildly competitive that the profitability of a firm is more influenced by things like currency fluctuations, regulatory and trade policies, raw materials costs, than by any decision the business actually makes, which I think is fascinating. Similarly, if you go to place, which is roughly distribution, most things are equally conveniently available everywhere in the world. I was really struck when I was in Mongolia, like how westernized the entire world is, because you could get the same things at the State Department store in Ulaanbaatar that you can get in the suburbs of Kansas City, which I thought was super, like, really telling. And when you get to promotion, there's certainly some license for creativity, but most of that's really good and pretty uniform. I think firms are running up against lower and lower returns based on pursuing an optimization strategy. And when you hit that, like, if you don't start investing in what is effectively R&D, you're gonna run up against a wall. So.
We have time for 2 more. There's one right up here up front, your colleague, and then right here.
Let someone else go. You can ask me on private.
Well, I think this
Okay,
is,
it's a good
I think
question for
valuable
everybody.
For the
Yeah, for sure.
room. So, given all the questions that, well, the proof is kind of in the pudding, right? I'll lead with that. Given all the questions that you've heard and seen and what you see in the field amongst, peer groups, how do you think we're doing from design thinking as an organization? And we've obviously grown a ton in the last year. So we've got more bodies to wrap their head around. So how do you think we're doing in terms of skilling our current people, hiring the right type of people, and all the things that make a good design thinking organization?
You mean we, VMLY&R, we? We are progressing rapidly in the right direction. I'm a hard grader, right? Like, I'm a hard grader. Like, I'm never giving my own organization an A. We are certainly at the forefront of WPP. When I look at the major holding companies in our business or in our sector, I think we're ahead of everybody. I think that we are not ahead of all categories. I think there are some other parts of the industry that are ahead of us, but I like the trajectory we're on. So
I was just curious.
no, we're best in class for our competition, depending on how you define our competition.
How would you okay? And then against other organizations that you maybe come and see that are maybe not direct competitors to us, how do we fare?
I mean, we at our best, we can go head to head with IDEO. There's no question about that. IDEO's total business is design thinking, and we're still growing into that space. But when we're at our best, we're best in the world in terms of where we're at from what I've seen.
The last
certainly
one's
for a
right
company
here.
of our
Jason,
scale.
over here.
So, looking at it from a customer perspective,
Yeah.
if you have a truly resistant industry, but you have created something that is truly innovative, how do you solve the problem of adoption? How do you get the customer to come over and say, wow, that is new and different, but we've always done it this way? How do you bring them into that new thought and product you've presented?
I would do three things. Number one, if the customer base you're trying to sell into is resistant, I would be really, really honest, and I would just very, 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 very honestly ask the question internally of, do we have the solution to a problem that doesn't exist, right? You have to look at it honestly.
Right.
The second thing that I would do is I would start looking at how can you begin to reframe it, reframe the offer against the problem. And oftentimes you can find the right unlock by just reframing what's the nature of the solution and reframing what's the nature of the problem until you get the right communication fit.
Yep.
Right? Clarity is really, really, really hard. Then the third thing that I would do is I would start reframing the notion of risk of change versus risk of inaction, right? Knowing that human beings have a very strong bias towards status quo. And another hiccup in the human brain is we have aversion to loss, and we tend to magnify what we stand to lose, and we tend to underestimate what we stand to gain from any change, right? And so if you can start reframing it and find a way to communicate that the risk of not making the change
Vital.
is way bigger and way scarier than the risk of making the change, then organizations tend to move pretty readily,
Great.
in my experience.
Thank you.
Please help me thank Jason again for being here.